everybody. So I did come through Memphis. I work for the comprehensive planning department there, but I did graduate from UMass Amherst, so I am here representing. My advisor, Elizabeth Hammond, couldn't attend due to the storm, so I am going to be talking about the recommendations that came out of my thesis study, which was a pilot study in the Pioneer Valley on assessing adaptive capacity of farmers, along with some of the findings that came out of my research. So essentially when I started this, my big idea was to actually look at agriculture and climate change impacts of the Arkansas Delta, because I had lived there in the past, and so now I'm back. It all comes full circle. But being a student at UMass and being in the Connecticut River Valley, that made a lot of sense to do as a pilot study because there's so many farmers in that area. So it made sense to look and see through, as a planner, when I'm looking at climate change adaptation plans or natural disaster plans, which are usually more common in larger cities, so they're not as common in rural areas. And then even more, when we're talking about climate change adaptation, it's very much from a land use perspective about infrastructure and other sorts of technologies that can mitigate and adapt in the future. But for a rural standpoint, what about the farmers that are located in Western Massachusetts that may or may not know kind of that climate change science? And then even more, if they don't know about it, well, how can they be prepared in the future? If they are aware of climate change science specifically and knowledge, what are they doing to adapt for the future? And are they aware of any resources that may or may not be available to them in their region? So essentially when I started my work, I wanted to look city by city in order to kind of see where planners fit as well. But then as I developed my thesis further, it grew more into a regional and county by county analysis. So again, I wanted to assess farmers and their on the ground knowledge and kind of compare that to the climate change knowledge that's out there to really see, does their story match up? And if not, what can we do to better support them? So briefly, this is the Pioneer Valley. The Connecticut River is in the middle. So Franklin County is closer to Vermont and New Hampshire to the north. Hampshire County contains Northampton and Amherst, also UMass Amherst. And then Springfield is located in Hampton County. And so Franklin County experiences a little bit cooler variations, along with it's hillier, it's rockier, but Hampshire County and Hampton County is a lot more flat with the fertile soils. So basically along this entire region, I was able to survey, well, technically I used an interview questionnaire in order to communicate with 10 farmers, even though I had an access to 218 on the database. So I talk about adaptive capacity, and in the research that I did, as well as climate change literature, there's a lot of variation, and I don't think there is a decided term that we're using yet of resiliency versus adaptive capacity, and they're used very interchangeably. Resiliency cannot be just measured by one single metric. And so when I use the term adaptive capacity to be measured of farmers, that to me incorporates different components. And so we talk about capitals like social capital, economic capital, all of these types, and all of those are incorporated into what could be the adaptive capacity of a farmer, of anybody really that has an interest in climate change and being prepared for the future. So for my thesis, I looked at just 3 components that I defined for adaptive capacity. So the first one was climate change knowledge, and that included both actual climate science and their personal knowledge through their past experiences. And the second component was past actions. So that included just how did they respond to these perceived weather changes that they may have attributed to be from climate change. And then the third component was, were they aware of any climate change resources and support systems out there? And if so, had they utilized them? And so in the end, I wanted to create an index of adaptive capacity to be able to understand and rate each farmer's level of their adaptive capacity. So if we were at 100%, we would be able to look at each one of these thirds and see how much they're either lacking or where their strengths were, and then that would be able to indicate where there could be some point of intervention for that farmer. So my research questions in the end were, what was the total adaptive capacity for each farmer, and then what were some places of intervention and support that we could give them. And then my secondary question was, county by county, what was each adaptive capacity for the counties, and then overall the Pioneer Valley as a region. So my survey sample ended up being 10 farms. That was mostly because I had done it in the winter time, and as it got closer to spring, right about now, actually, it gets really difficult to communicate with farmers, and that makes sense. And they represented 7 towns throughout the Pioneer Valley from all 3 counties. And so when I developed my questionnaire, it had 12 questions on it. It was meant to be more of very detailed interviews that I would then code and analyze through in vivo software. So when I had to go through my survey and kind of figure out which of my questions would be focusing on what components of adaptive capacity, in the end, out of my 12 questions, 8 were focused on combined knowledge, 4 were focused on past actions, and then 7 of them were focused on resources. So to be able to kind of pick apart what was being addressed by what they were saying. So some of the results, a majority of the farmers actually noticed changes to their farming over time, and many of them attributed that to be climate change. In my survey question, it asked if they believed it to be caused by climate change, and they agreed, but there was kind of an assumption that was built into that question that they had to already believe in climate change. So even though 70% believed in climate change, that distribution of belief was actually very variable. So some were very ambiguous in the way that they described that they believed in climate change. Some were very forthright in that they believed in it and had climate science knowledge that they knew of, which was only 1 person. And then some were just kind of afraid to really give a firm, strong opinion, but would eventually indicate that they did believe in it. And then I asked their ability to farm now versus the future, and more indicated that climate change would impact their farming negatively in the future. So the issues and actions, I then was able to go through and look at what were the most common issues that were being brought up. And the largest one was precipitation, which was the biggest ones were drought, dry weather conditions, and then actually stormier and wetter periods. And so how did that affect their yields over time, the variation? So when I gave this survey, actually it was in 2016 as well, and so we had just had the large drought in the valley, and so that was on every farmer's mind. So precipitation again. Another thing that was brought up were different storm events, isolated storm events, and how that also impacted yield at select events. Again, variable and not average temperature and precipitation. And then temperature was brought up, so that was already echoed in here as well, which were the seasonal changes, but really how variable it was throughout the season and not necessarily the average seasonal changes. Was really an effect for crop yield in the end. And irrigation as another topic that was brought up as an issue, mostly having to do with drought, but if the farmers didn't already have enough technology on hand or enough workers to actually irrigate their farms, then that became an issue. For actions, they were broken down by irrigation, soil technique manipulation, which was just like different types, as mentioned before, organic soil, and then costs associated with labor. So support and resources, 80% were unaware where I asked of practices, recommendations, or policies that address specifically climate change in the Pioneer Valley, but the results indicated that 90% felt slightly to highly prepared to start following these policies or recommendations if they knew about them. So they were inclined to actually receive aid, they just didn't know what that was. And surprisingly, 50% roughly identified that they knew of an organization in the Valley that provided support for climate change. However, when I looked back and confirmed with these organizations, though they provide resources for best practices in agriculture, they don't specifically say or mention climate change. And so this was a lot of trust in the farmers that, yes, they're working on this. Yes, somebody is accomplishing this, and not necessarily. So there's room for that in the future. So this is just up here to show that the farmer profiles of the 10 that I interviewed were very different. Some had more knowledge, some had taken more actions in the past, and some knew more of resources and just had better network connections. And so in developing my index, I wanted to just kind of be able to measure up against the counties kind of where each of the farms stood. Again, the index is created objectively. It's scaled according to the results of each of the farmers. But you can see that Hampshire County really does perform the best, and Franklin County, Hampton and Franklin County are more in the needs improvement and progressing area. And that just kind of breaks down more into that actions was the largest group that was mentioned in all of the findings. So past actions taken, and that makes sense because farmers exist and continue to work in agriculture because they know how to respond. They know how to take action over time. But what ends up really being missing is that really specific climate science knowledge and what are the resources available to them. So overall, when looking at my index, the Pioneer Valley scored 53.5% roughly out of 100 total adaptive capacity, which is rated in a low progressing level. To me, I wanted to then think about, well, okay, if this is where the Pioneer Valley is, what can be done to help with these farmers in the future? And so some of my recommendations are to just continue with this interview form and questionnaire that I developed and have it be given to extension faculty, technical service providers, more farmers, just to really get it right and make sure that we're asking the right sort of questions and getting the correct data. But many of you have also created survey instruments, which is excellent. And then just increasing support, and most of the time that is monetary support that was mentioned by farmers, especially in grants. But education is another great opportunity and resource. Many of the farmers articulated that if they had maybe a clearinghouse or a data network that they could refer to tell them when they should plant their crops. One farmer specifically had mentioned talking about tomato and late blight and how it used to be referred to as late blight, but now it doesn't really make sense to call it that anymore. So having a resource that could tell them when to plant would be really helpful. And so finally, I just want to say that farmers definitely know and are aware of the changes that they are seeing. And do they necessarily believe it's from climate change? No, but they still want to make the changes and obviously benefit their yields overall. And when we're talking about the Pioneer Valley, if you don't know, really these farms also make up the character of these places. And so these smaller farms, these family-run farms, when you really look at the basis, if they're not prepared, those are individual family farms that are not being prepared for the future. That's their economic stability, and then greater overall the region. That's all I have to say. Thank you.